"Daddy, she's crying," said the boy. When a powerful CEO tries to walk away from a poor single mom, one shocking secret about who he really is changes everything. But will he choose pride, or the family he never knew he had? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The city lights blurred through sheets of rain as Jonathan Hale pushed through the glass doors of Hale Enterprises. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor of the building's entrance, each step echoing in the empty lobby. Another late night, another victory in the boardroom that felt hollow. He loosened his silk tie, feeling its dampness from the short walk between his top-floor office and the elevator. The security guard nodded respectfully as Jonathan passed, but he barely noticed. His mind was already on tomorrow's meetings, the endless cycle of power plays and profit margins that had built his empire. The rain hammered against the building's facade, creating a steady drumbeat that matched his footsteps. Through the glass doors, he could see his car waiting at the curb, sleek and black like a shadow in the night. His driver, Matthews, stood ready with an umbrella. "Perhaps we should wait for the rain to let up, sir," Matthews suggested as Jonathan approached. "No," Jonathan replied firmly. "I need to review the Morrison contract before morning." His voice carried the weight of authority that had become second nature over years of commanding boardrooms. Just as Matthews opened the car door, Jonathan felt something pull at his coat. The touch was so light he almost missed it through the thick wool of his designer suit. He turned, irritation rising in his throat at the unexpected delay. A small boy stood there, maybe 5 or 6 years old, his brown eyes wide and searching. Rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and his thin jacket was soaked through. "Daddy," the boy said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "She's crying." Jonathan's first instinct was to pull away, to retreat into the sanctuary of his car. But something in those eyes held him still. The boy pointed toward a bus stop bench several yards away, where a woman sat hunched against the weather. She was trying to hold herself together, both literally and figuratively. Her shoulders shook with either cold or tears, possibly both. A worn purse lay fallen at her feet, its contents scattered across the wet sidewalk. Her clothes, though neat and clean, spoke of careful budgeting rather than comfort. "Michael," the woman called weakly, looking up. When she saw her son standing near Jonathan, her eyes widened with alarm. "Michael, come here right now!" She tried to stand but swayed unsteadily. Jonathan found himself moving forward before he could stop himself. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "I'm fine," she insisted, though her voice trembled. "Michael, please." She reached for her purse, but her hands were shaking too much to gather the spilled items. Something about her quiet dignity struck a chord in Jonathan. He remembered his own mother, years ago, trying to maintain her pride while struggling to make ends meet. The memory was unwelcome, and he pushed it aside. "Matthews," he called over his shoulder, "bring the umbrella here." His driver hurried over, sheltering them all from the downpour. Jonathan knelt, mindful of his expensive suit, and began collecting the scattered contents of the woman's purse. A worn wallet, some loose change, a small Bible, and what looked like a termination notice from Brighton Manufacturing. The woman, Grace, according to the letter, watched him with a mixture of embarrassment and wariness. Her son pressed close to her side now, but his eyes never left Jonathan. "You shouldn't be out in this weather," Jonathan said, his voice gruffer than he intended. He handed her the purse, noting how she clutched it like a shield. "Where are you headed?" "The shelter on 4th Street," she admitted quietly, then added quickly, "Just for tonight. We'll figure something out tomorrow." Jonathan felt an unfamiliar tug in his chest. The shelter on 4th Street was in a dangerous neighborhood, no place for a woman and child at this hour. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He had meetings tomorrow, contracts to review, a company to run. But the boy, Michael, was still watching him with those earnest eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed walls. "I can't in good conscience let you go there at this hour," Jonathan heard himself say. "I know a small hotel nearby, clean, safe. Let me at least drive you there." "We couldn't accept," Grace began. "Please," Jonathan cut in, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "It's just a ride, nothing more." Grace looked at her son, then at the dark street ahead, calculating her limited options. Finally, she nodded, her pride visibly warring with her practical need to protect her child. "Matthews, help them into the car," Jonathan directed, already regretting his impulse toward kindness. He told himself this was just a momentary deviation from his carefully ordered life, a small act of charity that would ease his conscience and then be forgotten. But as he watched Matthews help Grace to her feet, saw Michael's small hand slip trustingly into his mother's, Jonathan felt something shift inside him, like a crack appearing in a wall he hadn't even known he'd built. "Thank you," Grace whispered as she passed him, her eyes meeting his for just a moment. There was something in that look, strength beneath the weariness, pride beneath the gratitude, that made Jonathan want to step back, to retreat to the safety of his solitary world. Instead, he found himself following them to the car, telling himself this was just a passing kindness, nothing more. Just a small detour before he returned to his normal life of boardrooms and bottom lines. The rain continued to fall as Matthews held the car door open, and Jonathan watched as Grace and Michael slipped into the warm interior. He hesitated for just a moment before following them, not yet knowing that this simple act of mercy was about to change everything. The windshield wipers slashed back and forth against the downpour, their rhythmic movement the only steady sound in Jonathan's luxury car. He gripped the leather steering wheel tighter, stealing glances at his unexpected passengers in the rear-view mirror. The little boy, Michael, he'd said his name was, pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he watched the city lights dance through the rain. "Look, Mommy, that building looks like it's made of stars." Michael's voice broke through the tension, his finger pointing at a skyscraper decorated with twinkling office lights. "Yes, sweetheart," Grace replied softly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She sat straight-backed in the passenger seat, as if afraid to relax against the expensive leather. Her clothes were still damp from the rain, and Jonathan noticed she was trying not to drip on his car's interior. "You said you lost your job?" Jonathan kept his voice neutral, professional, the same tone he used in business meetings when discussing unfortunate but necessary layoffs. Grace nodded, swallowing hard before speaking. "The diner where I worked, it closed down last week. No notice." Her voice trembled slightly. "I've been looking for work everywhere, but with rent due." She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable sharing her struggles with a stranger. "And the boy's father?" Jonathan asked, immediately regretting the question when he saw Grace tense even further. "It's just us," she said firmly, then added in a softer tone. "It has been for a long time." Michael's cheerful voice piped up from the back seat. "Mommy makes the best pancakes at home. She puts happy faces on them with chocolate chips." Jonathan caught Grace's slight smile in the mirror, a mother's love breaking through her worry. Something about that simple expression made his chest tighten unexpectedly. "There's a decent motel about 10 minutes from here," Jonathan said, turning onto a less busy street. "I know the owner. He's trustworthy." He pulled out his phone at a red light, quickly typing out a message. "Mr. Hale, we couldn't possibly." Grace started to protest. "It's just a temporary solution." Jonathan cut her off, his tone businesslike again. "Consider it a businessman's donation to a worthy cause. Nothing more." The rest of the drive passed in relative silence, broken only by Michael's occasional exclamations about things he saw through the window. Jonathan found himself oddly drawn to the boy's innocent enthusiasm, so different from the calculated interactions he was used to in his corporate world. The motel wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and well-maintained. Jonathan had invested in it years ago, one of his smaller properties that actually turned a decent profit. He parked under the covered entrance, the rain still drumming steadily on the roof above. The night manager hurried out with an umbrella, responding to Jonathan's earlier message. "Room 115 is ready, Mr. Hale. Ground floor, 2 beds, just as you requested." Jonathan nodded, handling the paperwork quickly while Grace stood to the side, Michael's hand held tightly in hers. The boy was fighting sleep now, his earlier energy fading as he leaned against his mother's leg. "Everything's taken care of for the next week?" Jonathan explained, handing Grace the room key. "It should give you time to." He hesitated, uncertain how to finish that sentence without sounding condescending. Thank you, Grace said quietly, genuine gratitude in her voice. I don't know how to repay. As I said, it's just business, Jonathan interrupted, uncomfortable with her thanks. He reached for his wallet and pulled out several bills. For food and necessities. Grace started to shake her head, but Michael suddenly perked up, looking at Jonathan with bright eyes. Thank you, mister. You're really nice, just like Mommy said you would be. Jonathan frowned slightly at the odd comment, but before he could question it, Michael had wrapped his small arms around Jonathan's legs in a surprise hug. The gesture caught him completely off guard, and for a moment he stood frozen, unable to remember the last time anyone had hugged him so freely. Michael, honey, let go of Mr. Hale, Grace said gently, pulling her son back. He needs to leave now. Jonathan straightened his suit jacket, trying to regain his composure. Right. Well, everything's settled then. Good evening. He turned toward his car, keys already in hand, ready to put this strange encounter behind him. Mommy says you're my daddy. The whispered words stopped Jonathan mid-step. They hit him like a physical blow, making his keys slip from suddenly numb fingers to clatter on the wet pavement. Slowly, he turned back around, his heart pounding in his chest. Michael stood there innocently, while Grace had gone pale, her hands trembling as they gripped her son's shoulders. Jonathan stared at her, demanding answers without words, his world tilting on its axis as memories from years ago began to surface in his mind. Grace? His voice came out hoarse, barely audible over the continuing rain. The motel room's fluorescent light buzzed and flickered overhead, casting unsteady shadows across the worn carpet. The small space felt even more cramped with the heavy silence hanging between Grace and Jonathan. Rain drummed steadily against the window, a constant reminder of the storm that had brought them together. Michael, honey, Grace said, her voice gentle but firm. Why don't you go wash up? You're still damp from the rain. But Mom, Michael started to protest, his eyes darting between her and Jonathan. Please, sweetie. Use the nice soap we saw in there. Grace managed a warm smile, though her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed Michael's wet hair. The boy nodded reluctantly and disappeared into the bathroom. The sound of running water soon filled the awkward silence. Jonathan paced the small space between the beds, his expensive shoes marking a path on the thin carpet. His usually composed demeanor had cracked, revealing the turmoil beneath. Explain, he demanded, his voice low and controlled, despite the storm of emotions in his dark eyes. Now, Grace sank onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders squared despite her exhaustion. We met 6 years ago, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. At the Children's Hospital Charity Gala. Jonathan stopped pacing, his back to her. Recognition flickered across his face as the memory surfaced. I was working as a waitress for the catering company, Grace continued. You were different then. Not yet CEO. You smiled more. That doesn't prove anything. Jonathan cut in sharply, turning to face her. But there was uncertainty in his eyes now. You were kind to me that night. Grace pressed on, her fingers twisting in her lap. When one of the guests spilled wine on my uniform, you helped me clean up. We talked in the kitchen. You told me about your mother, about growing up without a father. Jonathan's jaw clenched. Those were details he rarely shared, especially now that he wore success like armor. One thing led to another, Grace said softly. It was just one night. When I found out I was pregnant, you had already been promoted to CEO. Your face was in the business papers, talking about corporate takeovers and million-dollar deals. And you didn't think to tell me? Jonathan's voice rose, though he quickly glanced at the bathroom door, conscious of Michael's presence. I saw who you were becoming, Grace replied, meeting his gaze steadily. The papers called you ruthless, ambitious. I didn't want anything from you, Jonathan. I chose to raise my son with dignity, not handouts. Dignity? Jonathan scoffed, gesturing at the shabby motel room. Is this what you call dignity? Living on the edge of homelessness? Grace stood up, her quiet strength filling the room. Yes, because my son knows he's loved. Because he sees me work honest jobs and keep my head high. That's worth more than any amount of money. Jonathan ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up in frustration. Do you have any proof? Documents? Pictures? Look at him, Jonathan, Grace said softly. Look at his eyes. They're your mother's eyes. The same warm brown that you have in the few photos where you actually smile. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He had noticed it earlier, but pushed the thought away. Michael's eyes, bright and gentle, were haunting echoes of his mother's. The woman who had raised him alone, who had faced discrimination and hardship with unwavering grace until cancer took her 3 years ago. This is impossible, he muttered, but the certainty had drained from his voice. I can't be. He couldn't even say the word. The bathroom door creaked, and Michael's voice drifted out, singing a childish tune about raindrops and sunshine. The simple melody pierced through Jonathan's carefully constructed walls. I never asked for your money, Grace said quietly. Never will. I just thought. He deserved to know who his father was, even if you want nothing to do with us. Jonathan strode to the door, yanking it open. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, but he barely noticed as it soaked through his expensive suit. He made it to his car, keys in hand, before stopping abruptly. The memory hit him with brutal clarity, standing at a window when he was Michael's age, watching his own father's car disappear down the street for the last time. His mother's quiet tears. The crushing weight of abandonment that had shaped every decision, every achievement, every wall he'd built around his heart. He stood there, rain running down his face, keys cutting into his palm. The same choice his father had made now lay before him, and for the first time in years, Jonathan Hale found himself completely unable to move. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jonathan's penthouse apartment, casting long shadows across his modern furniture and pristine hardwood floors. He stood at the window, an untouched cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The city sprawled below him, a testament to everything he'd built, everything he'd achieved. But this morning, his empire felt hollow. Grace's words from the night before echoed in his mind. I never wanted your money. I just thought he deserved to know who his father was. The simple truth in her voice had shaken him more than any boardroom confrontation ever had. His reflection stared back at him from the window, perfectly pressed suit, not a hair out of place. The image of success, but underneath, memories of his own childhood bubbled up like dark water. Empty chairs at school events, Christmas mornings without a father's smile, his mother's quiet tears when she thought he was sleeping. I won't be like him, Jonathan muttered, setting down his coffee cup with a sharp click. He straightened his tie, grabbed his keys, and headed for the elevator. He had questions that needed answers, and he wouldn't rest until he got them. The drive to the motel felt longer in daylight. The shabby building looked even more depressing under the morning sun, its faded paint and cracked concrete impossible to ignore. Jonathan parked his luxury car, feeling out of place among the rusty pickups and old sedans. He raised his hand to knock on their door but paused at the sound of voices inside. Sound it out, honey, Grace's gentle voice encouraged. Take your time, Elefant. Michael's small voice worked through the word carefully. That's right, you're doing so well. Jonathan's knock interrupted their lesson. There was a shuffle of movement before Grace opened the door, surprise flickering across her tired face. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her sleepless night, but she stood straight, meeting his gaze without flinching. Mr. Hale, she said formally, stepping back to let him in. The motel room looked different in daylight. Smaller, shabbier. Michael sat cross-legged on one of the beds, schoolbooks spread around him like a paper fortress. His face lit up at the sight of Jonathan. Hi. Michael waved enthusiastically, then turned back to his workbook with determination. Jonathan's prepared demands for proof died in his throat as he watched Grace return to her spot beside Michael. She settled down carefully, as if her body ached, but her smile never wavered as she pointed to the next word in the book. We're working on reading, she explained, not meeting Jonathan's eyes. Michael's teacher sent some extra practice sheets home. Jonathan noticed the wrinkled uniform hanging in the bathroom doorway. A diner uniform, he realized. The same one she'd been wearing when he found them in the rain. A small pile of carefully folded clothes sat in the corner, probably everything they owned. Grace, he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. We need to talk about arrangements. She tensed, but nodded, turning to Michael. "Sweetie, can you practice the next page on your own for a few minutes? Just like we discussed?" "Okay, Mom." Michael beamed, proud to be trusted with independent work. Grace led Jonathan to the far corner of the room, speaking in low tones. "I told you, I'm not asking for anything. As soon as I find another job—" "Let me help," Jonathan interrupted, surprising himself. "Temporarily," he added quickly, "until you get back on your feet." Grace's pride warred visibly with practicality on her face. She glanced at Michael, who was mouthing words silently as he read, his small finger tracing each letter carefully. "I can't accept charity," she whispered. "It's not charity," Jonathan replied firmly. He struggled for words that wouldn't sound patronizing. "It's an investment in his future." Grace's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "We've managed this long on our own, and you've done an amazing job," Jonathan said, meaning it more than he expected to. "But everyone needs help sometimes." The words felt strange in his mouth. He'd spent years believing the opposite. After a long moment, Grace nodded slowly. "Only until I find work," she insisted. "And only the basics." Jonathan pulled out his checkbook, writing an amount that made Grace's eyes widen. When she started to protest, he held up his hand. "For rent deposit, food, and new school supplies," he said firmly. "Nothing extravagant." "Thank you," Grace whispered, accepting the check with trembling fingers. "I'll have my assistant arrange for a more suitable apartment," Jonathan added, already reaching for his phone. "Something closer to Michael's school." "Mr. Hale," Grace's voice stopped him. "Please don't let him think." She struggled to find the words. "Don't make promises we can't keep." The weight of her words settled heavily in Jonathan's chest. He nodded curtly, gathering his coat. "I'll have someone contact you about the apartment." "Done," Michael announced proudly from the bed, holding up his workbook. "Want to see?" Jonathan hesitated, then shook his head. "Another time, perhaps," he said, heading for the door. He told himself it was better this way. Clean, professional, detached. But as he walked to his car, he heard the window slide open behind him. Michael's small voice called out, "Bye! Thank you!" Jonathan glanced back. The boy was waving enthusiastically from the window, his smile bright and unreserved. Grace stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder, her expression unreadable. Something twisted in Jonathan's chest, sharp and unexpected. He got into his car quickly, adjusting his rearview mirror to avoid seeing them watching him leave. But the ache remained, following him all the way back to his empty penthouse. The evening air had cooled considerably as Jonathan's black Mercedes pulled up to Pete's Family Diner, a modest establishment with neon signs flickering in the windows. It wasn't his usual dining spot, far from the upscale restaurants he frequented for business meetings, but he figured it would be more comfortable for Grace and Michael. He watched through the windshield as Grace helped Michael out of the back seat, straightening the boy's slightly wrinkled t-shirt. The child's eyes lit up at the sight of the diner's cheerful exterior, and despite himself, Jonathan felt a small smile tugging at his lips. Inside, the vinyl booths squeaked as they slid in, Michael insisting on sitting next to Jonathan while Grace took the opposite side. The laminated menus were slightly sticky, and Jonathan tried not to think about the last time they'd been properly cleaned. "Can I get chocolate milk?" Michael asked, his feet swinging beneath the table, barely reaching halfway to the floor. "Water is fine," Grace said softly, but Jonathan shook his head. "Let him have the chocolate milk," he said, then added quickly, "just this once." Michael's face broke into a wide grin, and Jonathan felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. A middle-aged waitress with graying hair and a name tag reading Betty approached their table, her pen poised over a small notepad. "What can I get for this beautiful family?" she asked cheerfully. Jonathan stiffened. "We're not," he began, but Michael cut him off. "I want a cheeseburger. With extra pickles, please." Grace studied her menu intently, her shoulders tense. "Just a garden salad for me, thank you." "The lady will have a cheeseburger as well," Jonathan said firmly. When Grace looked up to protest, he added, "You barely ate anything at breakfast this morning." He'd noticed when he'd stopped by the motel earlier. After Betty left with their orders, Jonathan folded his hands on the table. "We need to discuss some things," he began, his CEO voice slipping into place. Michael was busy creating an elaborate design with the paper wrapper from his straw, blissfully unaware of the tension between the adults. Grace nodded slightly, her fingers nervously twisting a paper napkin. "I need to understand exactly what you want from me," Jonathan said, keeping his voice low. "And I need to know everything about," he glanced at Michael. "About that night." Grace's cheeks flushed, but she met his gaze steadily. "I was working the charity gala at the Renaissance Hotel. You'd just made partner at your firm. You were celebrating." "I remember," Jonathan said, though the memory was hazy. It had been a wild night of champagne and success. "You were kind to me," Grace continued softly. "You noticed I was tired and offered me a ride home. One thing led to another. And you never thought to tell me?" There was an edge to his voice now. "Mommy, can I go look at the jukebox?" Michael interrupted, pointing to the colorful machine in the corner. "Stay where I can see you," Grace called as the boy slid out of the booth. Once Michael was out of earshot, she continued, "I tried to find you afterward. But you'd already left the country for that expansion project in Europe. By the time you returned months later, you were all over the business news, CEO of Hale Industries. I saw how far you'd risen, and she swallowed hard. I couldn't bear to be the scandal that ruined everything you'd built." Their food arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. Michael returned to the table, immediately diving into his burger with childish enthusiasm. Grace picked at her food until Jonathan gave her a pointed look. "I still don't understand why now," Jonathan pressed. "After all these years?" Grace wiped Michael's chin with a napkin before responding. "He started asking questions about his father. I couldn't lie to him. He deserved to know the truth, even if," she trailed off, watching Michael attempt to fit an oversized bite into his mouth. "Even if what?" "Even if you wanted nothing to do with us," she finished quietly. "I never wanted your money, Jonathan. I've worked hard to provide for him on my own, but he needed to know who his father was, even if just to have an answer when other kids asked." Jonathan studied her face, looking for signs of deception, but found only sincerity and a quiet dignity that both impressed and unsettled him. Here was a woman who had raised his son alone, never seeking a penny of his considerable fortune, while he'd spent years building an empire that suddenly felt meaningless. "How do I know he's really?" Jonathan began, but Grace cut him off. "Look at him," she said simply. "Really look at him." Jonathan turned to Michael, who was carefully arranging his French fries in size order. The boy had his mother's gentle nature, but the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes. Jonathan saw himself there, and it terrified him. As they finished their meal, Michael regaled them with stories about his first-grade class, his favorite superhero, and his dream of becoming an astronaut. Despite his reservations, Jonathan found himself drawn into the boys' enthusiastic chatter, answering questions about rockets and space stations. When they stood to leave, Jonathan heard a familiar voice that made his blood run cold. "Jonathan Hale? Is that you?" Richard Maxwell, a fellow CEO and occasional golf partner, stood near the entrance, his expensive suit looking out of place in the humble diner. His eyes traveled from Jonathan to Grace, in her simple dress, then to Michael, and a knowing smirk spread across his face. "I hardly expected to find you in a place like this," Maxwell said, his tone dripping with barely concealed disdain, "and with such interesting company." Jonathan felt his jaw clench. He saw Grace shrink slightly under Maxwell's scrutinizing gaze, and Michael pressed closer to his mother's side, suddenly shy. Maxwell's smirk widened as he adjusted his designer tie. "Well, I'll leave you to your evening. Though you might want to be more discreet about your charitable works, Jonathan. People talk, you know." The words hung in the air like poison, and Jonathan felt the familiar sting of judgment he'd worked so hard to rise above. He watched Maxwell saunter away, already reaching for his phone, no doubt eager to share this juicy bit of gossip with their social circle. Grace touched his arm gently. "We should go," she whispered, understanding in her eyes. Jonathan nodded stiffly, leading them out to the parking lot, the pleasant atmosphere of their dinner shattered by Maxwell's cruel intrusion. Jonathan stared at the spreadsheets on his computer screen, but the numbers blurred together. His usual laser focus had abandoned him. Instead, his mind kept drifting to Michael's bright eyes and Grace's quiet dignity at dinner the night before. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Hale, his assistant, Sarah, stood in the doorway, with a concerned look. The budget meeting started 5 minutes ago. Everyone's waiting in the conference room. What? Jonathan checked his watch and frowned. He never lost track of time like this. Right. Tell them I'll be there in a moment. Sir? Sarah hesitated. Is everything all right? You seem different today? Jonathan straightened his tie, trying to reclaim his usual commanding presence. I'm fine, just distracted with some personal matters. Personal matters. The words felt foreign on his tongue. When was the last time he'd had anything truly personal to deal with? His life had been all business for so long. The morning dragged by in a fog of unfocused meetings and half-heard conversations. By lunch, Jonathan had made up his mind. He grabbed his keys and headed for the elevator, ignoring the surprised looks from his staff. He never left the office during lunch hours. 20 minutes later, he pulled up to the motel where Grace and Michael were staying. The place looked even shabbier in daylight. Peeling paint, crooked numbers on the doors, a broken vending machine in the corner. His chest tightened at the thought of his son. The words still felt strange. Living here. He found Grace sitting on the bed with Michael, helping him with what looked like math homework. They both looked up when he knocked on the open door. Mr. Hale, Grace said, surprise evident in her voice. We weren't expecting you. Jonathan. Michael's face lit up, and Jonathan felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. I've been thinking, Jonathan said, stepping into the room. He noticed Grace's defensive posture, the way she subtly shifted closer to Michael. About Michael's education. Grace's expression turned wary. What about it? There's a private school near my office, Riverside Academy. They have an excellent academic program, small class sizes, and... He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'd like to enroll Michael there. That's not necessary, Grace said quickly. The public school near our old apartment is fine. Is it a fancy school? Michael asked, eyes wide with curiosity. Jonathan smiled despite himself. Yes, it Island. They have a great science lab, art studio, and even a swimming pool. Wow. Michael bounced on the bed. Can I go, Mommy? Please? Grace bit her lip, looking torn. It's very generous, but we can't accept... This isn't about you or me, Jonathan interrupted, softer than his usual business tone. It's about giving Michael the best opportunities possible. Isn't that what we both want? The room fell silent except for the hum of the old air conditioner. Grace studied Jonathan's face, searching for hidden motives. He met her gaze steadily, letting her see his sincerity. The semester's already started, she said finally, and we don't have the proper clothes or supplies. I'll take care of everything, Jonathan assured her. The headmaster owes me a favor. We can get Michael enrolled by next week. Michael jumped off the bed and ran to Jonathan, wrapping his small arms around Jonathan's legs. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The simple gesture caught Jonathan off guard. He felt something crack in his carefully maintained facade. Slowly, hesitantly, he placed a hand on Michael's head, feeling the soft curls under his palm. A genuine smile spread across his face, not the polished one he used in board meetings, but something real and warm. You're welcome, buddy, he said softly. Grace watched the interaction with mixed emotions playing across her face. This is a big step, she warned. You can't just drop in and out of his life when it's convenient. Jonathan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. I know. They spent the next hour discussing practical details, uniforms, school supplies, transportation arrangements. Michael sat between them, drawing pictures of what he imagined his new school would look like, complete with a giant swimming pool and a laboratory full of bubbling beakers. When Jonathan finally left, Michael hugged him again. This time, Jonathan knelt down and hugged him back properly, breathing in the scent of drugstore shampoo and childhood innocence. Later that night, Jonathan lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse apartment. The city lights created shifting patterns through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything around him spoke of wealth and success: the Italian sheets, the designer furniture, the spectacular view of the skyline. But for the first time in years, these symbols of his achievement felt hollow. Instead, his mind kept returning to the feeling of Michael's small arms around his legs, the trust in those innocent eyes, the way Grace's stern expression had softened when he promised to be reliable. He'd meant to keep his distance, to provide financial support while maintaining clear boundaries, but today he'd taken a step that couldn't be easily undone. School enrollment meant regular involvement, parent-teacher conferences, school events. It meant becoming a real presence in Michael's life. Jonathan turned onto his side, watching the city lights flicker. He'd crossed a line today, made a commitment he hadn't intended. The strange thing was, as unsettling as it felt, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Sleep eluded him as he lay there, caught between the familiar territory of his controlled, successful life and the unknown path he'd started down today. The path of being someone's father. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the city's glass towers as Jonathan's black Mercedes pulled up to Grace's modest apartment building. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, still uncertain about this new routine they'd agreed to try. Michael burst out the front door, his backpack bouncing, while Grace followed more slowly behind him. "Good morning, Mr. Jonathan." Michael's enthusiasm cut through the morning quiet as he climbed into the back seat. His school uniform was slightly wrinkled but clean, and his shoes had been carefully polished. "Good morning, Michael." Jonathan couldn't help but smile at the boy's energy. He caught Grace's eye in the rearview mirror as she helped Michael with his seatbelt. "Grace." She nodded, her expression a mixture of gratitude and caution. "Thank you for doing this. I can usually manage the bus, but—" "It's no trouble," Jonathan interrupted, not wanting her thanks. This was the least he could do, wasn't it? "The school's on my way to the office." Grace stepped back from the car, wrapping her arms around herself in the cool morning air. "Have a good day, sweetheart," she called to Michael. "Be good." As they pulled away from the curb, Michael pressed his face against the window, waving until his mother disappeared from view. Then he settled back, his eyes wide with curiosity as he took in the car's leather interior. "Your car is so fancy," Michael observed, running his small hand along the seat. "Do all business people have cars like this?" Jonathan glanced in the rearview mirror. "Not all of them. I worked very hard to get where I am." "What do you do at work? Do you have a big office?" "Mom says you're—" "I am important." Michael carefully sounded out the word. A warm feeling spread through Jonathan's chest at the boy's genuine interest. When was the last time anyone had asked him about his work without wanting something? "I'm the CEO of Hale Industries. That means I'm in charge of making sure the company runs smoothly." "Like a captain of a ship?" Jonathan chuckled. "Something like that. Do you have meetings?" "Mom has meetings at her new job. She says they're boring." "Yes, I have lots of meetings." Jonathan found himself relaxing into the conversation. "Some are boring, but they help us make important decisions. Can I see where you work sometime?" Michael's hopeful tone stirred something in Jonathan's memory. Himself at that age, wondering about his own absent father's life. Jonathan swallowed hard. "We'll see. Maybe after school someday." The rest of the drive was filled with Michael's questions about everything from the traffic lights to the tall buildings they passed. Jonathan found himself explaining things he'd long taken for granted, seeing the city through fresh eyes. That afternoon, true to his word, Jonathan brought Michael to his office. The boy's eyes grew wide as they rode the elevator to the top floor, his small hand gripping Jonathan's as they stepped out into the marble-floored reception area. "This is all yours?" Michael whispered, awed by the floor, to ceiling windows and modern art adorning the walls. "This whole floor belongs to the executive team," Jonathan explained, noting how his employees tried to hide their stares as he walked past with Michael. He heard the whispers start immediately. The great Jonathan Hale with a child? Who was this boy? In his office, Michael ran straight to the windows. "You can see forever from here." He pressed his hands against the glass, leaving small smudges that would have normally irritated Jonathan. Instead, he found himself smiling. "Would you like to sit in my chair?" Jonathan offered, gesturing to his large leather executive chair. Michael scrambled into it, spinning once before grabbing the desk to stop himself. "This is the best chair ever. Is this where you be the captain?" "That's right." Jonathan leaned against his desk, watching as Michael pretended to type on the keyboard and answer imaginary phone calls. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her professional mask slipping slightly as she took in the scene. "Mr. Hale, your 3 o'clock is here." "Thank you, Sarah." Jonathan straightened up. "Michael, we should get you back to your mother." Michael's face fell slightly, but he nodded and slid out of the chair. As they walked toward the elevator, they passed a group of board members who didn't bother to lower their voices. "First, the woman from the streets, now this," one muttered. "Has he lost his mind?" Jonathan felt Michael's hand tighten in his, and something protective surged in his chest. He turned to face them, but before he could speak, Michael looked up at him with innocent eyes. "Dad, can we get ice cream before going home?" The word hung in the air. Dad. So simple, yet it hit Jonathan like a physical force. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. The board members forgotten, he looked down at Michael's hopeful face and saw trust there, pure and unconditional. Jonathan's voice was rough. He cleared his throat and tried again, his heart pounding. "Sure, buddy. Ice cream sounds good." Michael beamed, swinging their joined hands as they walked to the elevator, while Jonathan tried to process the emotions surging through him. That one word had somehow made everything more real, more serious. More wonderful and terrifying all at once. Jonathan stared up at the modest white church, its wooden steeple reaching toward the cloudless blue sky. The paint was faded in places, and the steps creaked under his polished shoes. This wasn't his usual Sunday morning routine of coffee and stock reports. "Come on." Michael tugged at his sleeve, practically bouncing with excitement. "Pastor James tells the best stories." Grace walked beside them in a simple blue dress, her hair tied back with a ribbon. She looked different here, more at peace, somehow. Jonathan felt out of place in his designer suit among the casual churchgoers filing inside. "We usually sit near the middle," Grace said softly, gesturing to a worn wooden pew. Jonathan nodded stiffly, following them into the row. The cushions were thin, nothing like the plush leather seats in his corporate boardroom. Michael settled between them, swinging his legs and waving to other children. The familiar sense of old wood, worn hymnals, and lingering incense filled the air. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the worn carpet. "Good morning, everyone." Pastor James stepped up to the pulpit, his warm smile reaching every corner of the sanctuary. He was older than Jonathan expected, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Today, we're going to talk about something that touches all our hearts: family and forgiveness." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably. Grace must have planned this, he thought. But when he glanced at her, she was focused entirely on the pastor, her expression serene. "You know, family isn't just about blood," Pastor James continued, his voice carrying clearly through the small space. "It's about choice. Every day, we choose whether to open our hearts or close them, whether to build walls or bridges." The congregation nodded, several offering quiet amens. Jonathan found himself studying the other families, parents with children, elderly couples holding hands, single mothers like Grace who came alone but seemed part of something bigger. "I remember a young woman who used to sit right there." Pastor James gestured to a pew near the front. "She faced discrimination, worked 3 jobs, but never lost her faith. She taught her son that true strength isn't in power or money, but in the capacity to love." Jonathan's breath caught. He knew, somehow, that the pastor was talking about his mother. He hadn't thought about her faith in years, how she'd tried to bring him to church before everything fell apart. The choir stood to sing, and Grace's voice rose clear and strong with the others. Jonathan watched, transfixed, as tears gathered in her eyes, but didn't fall. She sang about grace and redemption, her face glowing with something he couldn't quite name. Michael leaned against Jonathan's arm, humming along in his child's way. The weight of him felt right, somehow. Natural. Jonathan's throat tightened as memories of his own childhood surfaced, wanting someone to lean against, finding empty space instead. "The hardest walls to break down," Pastor James was saying, "are the ones we build ourselves. Pride, fear, old hurts, they become our prison. But God specializes in new beginnings, in second chances." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Jonathan noticed his hands were clenched in his lap, and consciously relaxed them. A baby cried softly in the back, quickly hushed. Someone coughed. Life's small sounds filled the sacred space. Every child, the pastor's voice grew gentle, is a bridge of hope. Through them we learn to love again, to trust again. They show us what really matters. Michael squirmed, pulling out a crayon to draw on the back of a church bulletin. Jonathan watched him sketch what looked like 3 figures holding hands. His chest felt tight. Grace reached over to smooth Michael's hair, her fingers gentle. For a moment, their eyes met over their son's head. No accusation in her gaze, just quiet strength and maybe, though it scared him to see it, hope. The service drew to a close with another hymn. Jonathan didn't sing, but he listened. The voices around him blended in harmony, filling the small church with something larger than themselves. He thought of board meetings and profit margins, of empty achievements that had never filled the hollow space inside him. People began gathering their things, the air filling with quiet conversation. Michael jumped up, his drawing forgotten on the pew. "Can we get donuts?" he asked, looking from Grace to Jonathan with bright eyes. "They always have donuts after church." Before either could answer, he grabbed their hands, one in each of his small ones. His grip was warm, insistent, pulling them together as naturally as breathing. Jonathan looked down at their joined hands, his large one, Michael's tiny fingers, Grace's work-worn palm. Standing there between them, Michael beamed up at his parents, becoming the bridge Pastor James had spoken about. Not a bridge of convenience or obligation, but one of pure love and possibility. The morning sun streamed stronger through the windows now, warming the old wooden pews. Around them, the congregation moved in familiar patterns of fellowship, but for Jonathan, everything felt new, strange, terrifying, and somehow right. The Monday morning sun blazed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jonathan's executive office, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. He adjusted his tie, preparing for the weekly leadership meeting, when snippets of conversation drifted through his open door. "Did you hear about Hale's latest project?" A mocking voice carried down the hallway. "Seems our prestigious CEO has picked up a charity case." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes fixed on the financial reports spread across his desk. The voices grew louder as 2 executives passed by, pretending not to notice him. "A waitress and her kid? Really?" Another voice chuckled. "How charitable of him." His assistant, Sarah, appeared at the door with his morning coffee. Her expression was sympathetic as she set the steaming cup on his desk. "They've been talking all morning, sir." "Let them talk," Jonathan said, but his voice carried an edge that betrayed his irritation. The morning meeting started like any other, with department heads filing into the gleaming conference room. Jonathan took his usual seat at the head of the table, but today the atmosphere felt different. Whispers ceased when he spoke. Knowing glances were exchanged. Daniel Cross sat directly across from him, a predatory smile playing on his lips. While other executives discussed quarterly projections, Daniel's attention remained fixed on Jonathan, like a cat watching a mouse. "Before we wrap up," Daniel spoke up, his voice smooth as silk but laced with venom, "I think we should discuss the company's public image." Jonathan's pen stopped moving across his notepad. "The PR department handles that, Cross. Unless you have specific concerns?" "Oh, I do." Daniel leaned forward, placing a manila folder on the table. "It's come to my attention that certain members of our leadership team have been spotted in some interesting company." The room grew still. Jonathan could feel every eye on him. "If you have something to say, Daniel, say it directly." Daniel's smile widened. "I've been doing some research on your new friends. Grace Turner, is it? Single mother. Series of dead-end jobs. Multiple addresses in the past year alone." He tapped the folder. "Quite a colorful history." Jonathan's knuckles turned white around his pen. "My personal life is not up for discussion in this meeting. It becomes our business when it affects shareholder confidence," Daniel countered. "People talk, Jonathan. They wonder why a CEO of your standing suddenly takes interest in a woman like that." "Choose your next words carefully," Jonathan warned, his voice low and dangerous. I'm only looking out for the company's interests. Daniel spread his hands in a gesture of false concern. We wouldn't want anyone thinking our leadership has lost focus. Or worse, that there might be inappropriate relationships influencing business decisions. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jonathan stood slowly, his chair rolling back. "Meeting adjourned," he announced, his tone brooking no argument. As people hurried to gather their things, he added, "Daniel, stay." Once the room cleared, Jonathan closed the door. Daniel remained seated, that irritating smile still in place. "Whatever game you're playing, stop it now," Jonathan said. "Game? I'm simply doing my due diligence." Daniel stood, straightening his expensive suit. "Did you know she was evicted twice last year? Or that she's behind on her son's medical bills? Makes one wonder what she really wants from you." Jonathan stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay away from Grace and Michael. This is your only warning." "Or what?" Daniel challenged. "You'll fire me? That would raise even more questions, wouldn't it? Besides, I'm not the one you should worry about. The board members are already asking questions." After Daniel left, Sarah entered with concern etched on her face. "Sir, I couldn't help overhearing. Maybe you should be careful. Daniel Cross has a reputation for destroying people who get in his way." Jonathan walked to the window, looking out over the city sprawled below. The same view that usually filled him with pride now felt suffocating. Somewhere out there, Grace was probably at work, Michael at his new school, both of them unaware they'd become targets in a corporate power play. "Get me everything we have on Daniel Cross," he told Sarah. "Every project he's handled, every decision he's made, every penny he's spent." "Sir?" Sarah hesitated. "Are you sure that's wise?" Jonathan watched his reflection in the glass, seeing not the powerful CEO but a man caught between two worlds, the corporate realm he'd built his life around and the unexpected family that was slowly changing his heart. "What's wise," he said quietly, "is protecting what matters." Sarah nodded and left him alone with his thoughts. The morning sun continued its climb, casting his shadow long across the office floor. In the distance, a church bell tolled, reminding him of Grace's quiet faith during yesterday's service. The contrast between that peaceful moment and today's corporate warfare couldn't have been starker. His phone buzzed with a message from Grace. "Michael got an A on his math test. He wants to show you." Such a simple thing, but it made his chest tighten. In the reflection of the window, he watched his own expression soften. Then he caught sight of Daniel Cross in the parking lot below, already on his phone, no doubt digging deeper into Grace's past. The life he'd built, the reputation he'd crafted so carefully, was becoming tangled with whispers and speculation. Every move he made with Grace and Michael would now be scrutinized, twisted, and used against him. His private joy was becoming public fodder for office gossip and corporate manipulation. Jonathan straightened his tie, a gesture that usually gave him confidence. Today, it felt like adjusting armor for a battle he never expected to fight. The morning sun highlighted the silver at his temples, making him look older than his years. He thought of Michael's proud smile, of Grace's gentle strength, and knew he had decisions to make. The Saturday morning sun painted golden streaks across the city park's dewy grass. Jonathan stood by his parked car, watching as Michael bounced excitedly near the playground, his small hand clutching a bright blue kite. Grace walked beside him, her sundress flowing in the gentle breeze, a picnic basket hanging from her arm. "Can we fly it now, Dad, please?" Michael's eyes sparkled with anticipation. Jonathan's heart did a small flip at being called Dad. It still felt new, like a shoe that hadn't been broken in yet. "Let's find the perfect spot first, buddy." They walked together across the sprawling green space, passing other families spread out on checkered blankets. Jonathan noticed how different this felt from his usual weekends of business calls and lonely meals in his penthouse. Grace spread out their blanket under a spreading oak tree. "This looks like a good spot. The wind's just right here." Michael could barely contain himself as Jonathan helped him unwind the kite string. "Hold it up high," Jonathan instructed, remembering suddenly how his own mother had once taught him this same lesson. "Now run with it, but not too fast." The boy took off across the grass, his sneakers pounding the earth as the kite bobbed and weaved behind him. Grace watched them both, a soft smile playing on her lips. "He's never had anyone to do this with before," she said quietly. Jonathan felt something tighten in his chest. "I missed so much." "You're here now," Grace replied, her voice gentle. "That's what matters." They spent the next hour taking turns with the kite, teaching Michael how to guide it through the air. The boys' laughter echoed across the park every time the blue diamond soared higher into the sky. When Michael finally tired of the kite, Jonathan surprised them both by producing 3 ice cream cones from a nearby vendor. They sat on the blanket, Michael's face soon covered in chocolate. "You've got a little." Grace reached over with a napkin to wipe Michael's chin. The boy squirmed away, giggling. "Mom, I can do it myself." Jonathan watched them, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. This simple moment, sitting on a blanket, eating ice cream, watching his son's face light up with joy, felt more valuable than any business deal he'd ever closed. As the afternoon wore on, Michael convinced them to join him in an impromptu game of tag. Jonathan couldn't remember the last time he'd run just for fun, his expensive dress shoes getting stained with grass. Grace's laughter rang out as she dodged Michael's attempts to catch her, her hair coming loose from its neat ponytail. They collapsed back onto the blanket, breathless and happy. Michael curled up against Jonathan's side, his small body warm and trusting. "This is the best day ever," he declared. Grace caught Jonathan's eye over their son's head. "You're different here," she observed. "Away from the office, the suits, all of it. This is who you could be, all the time, you know." Jonathan felt his defenses start to rise, but something in Grace's expression made him pause. There was no judgment in her words, only gentle truth. "I don't know how to be this person all the time," he admitted quietly. "Yes, you do," Grace answered. "You just have to let go of what you think you need to be." The sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Michael had dozed off, his head heavy against Jonathan's shoulder. They packed up the picnic things, working in comfortable silence. As they walked back to the car, Michael sleepily holding both their hands, Grace stopped suddenly. "Thank you for today," she said softly. "For giving him these memories. For giving us both something real." Jonathan turned to face her, struck by how the setting sun caught the gold in her hair, how her eyes held both strength and vulnerability. Without thinking, he leaned forward, drawn by something he couldn't name. Their faces were inches apart when reality crashed back in. Jonathan jerked back, his heart pounding. What was he doing? This wasn't part of the plan. Getting close meant getting hurt. Getting close meant risking everything he'd built. He cleared his throat and stepped away, missing the flash of disappointment in Grace's eyes. "We should get going. It's getting late." The drive home was quiet, filled with Michael's soft snores from the back seat and the weight of words left unsaid. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to ignore how right the day had felt and how much that terrified him. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in designer gowns mingled, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Jonathan adjusted his bow tie, feeling unusually nervous as he guided Grace through the entrance. Grace looked stunning in a simple navy blue evening gown that Jonathan had insisted on buying for her. Her dark hair was swept up elegantly, revealing the gentle curve of her neck. She carried herself with quiet dignity, though her fingers fidgeted with her small clutch purse. "You look beautiful," Jonathan whispered, surprising himself with his sincerity. Grace's cheeks flushed pink as she smiled up at him. Heads turned as they made their way across the ballroom. Jonathan could hear the hushed whispers, see the raised eyebrows. His board members exchanged meaningful glances. Some of his closest business associates deliberately looked away. "Jonathan!" a shrill voice called out. Barbara Chen, his marketing director, approached with an overly bright smile. "How unexpected to see you here with a guest." "Barbara, this is Grace Turner," Jonathan said firmly. "Grace, Barbara handles our marketing department." Barbara's eyes swept over Grace with barely concealed judgment. "Charmed, I'm sure. And where did you two meet?" Before Grace could answer, Jonathan steered her toward the bar. "Would you like something to drink?" "Just water, please," Grace said softly. She seemed to shrink under the scrutiny of the crowd. As Jonathan ordered their drinks, he spotted Daniel Cross moving through the crowd like a shark circling its prey. The man's trademark smirk made Jonathan's jaw clench. "Well, well," Daniel drawled, approaching them. "The mighty Jonathan Hale finally brings a date to one of these tedious affairs." He extended his hand to Grace. "Daniel Cross. I've been dying to meet the woman who's captured our Jonathan's attention." Grace shook his hand politely, but Jonathan noticed her slight withdrawal. He placed a protective hand on her lower back, drawing her closer. "If you'll excuse us, Daniel," Jonathan began. "Oh, but the evening's just getting interesting," Daniel interrupted, raising his voice slightly. Several nearby conversations quieted. "In fact, I've been doing some research about your lovely companion." Jonathan's spine stiffened. "This isn't the time or place. Did you know," Daniel continued, addressing the growing audience, "that Miss Turner here has quite the colorful history?" He pulled out his phone, making a show of scrolling through it. 3 eviction notices in the past 5 years. Multiple overdue utility bills. A string of minimum wage jobs, my favorite being the midnight shift at Jerry's Diner. The whispers grew louder. Grace stood frozen, her face pale but her chin lifted. "Tell me, Miss Turner," Daniel's voice dripped with false concern. "How does someone go from serving greasy spoons to dining at corporate galas? It's quite the Cinderella story." Jonathan's hand tightened into a fist. "That's enough, Cross." But Daniel wasn't finished. He turned to address the crowd directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, meet Jonathan Hale's latest charitable project. A struggling single mother from the wrong side of town. How noble of our CEO to take pity on her." Grace's shoulders trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "I've never been ashamed of working honest jobs to support my son." "Ah, yes, the son," Daniel's eyes glittered maliciously. "Now, that's an interesting detail." "I said that's enough," Jonathan's voice boomed across the ballroom. The music seemed to falter. But as he looked around at the scandalized faces of his peers, at the barely concealed sneers and judgmental stares, something inside Jonathan snapped. Years of carefully cultivated reputation, of fighting his way to the top, seemed to crumble around him. He turned to Grace, his face twisted with anger and shame. "Is this what you wanted?" he hissed. "To humiliate me in front of everyone?" Grace's eyes widened with hurt. "Jonathan, I never—" "Was this your plan all along?" His voice rose, fueled by pride and fear. "To worm your way into my life? Drag me down to your level?" Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she held her ground. "How dare you?" she whispered. "After everything, you still think so little of me?" "What am I supposed to think?" Jonathan gestured sharply at the crowd. "Look at this mess. My reputation." "Your reputation?" Grace's voice cracked. "That's all you care about? Not the truth? Not Michael? Not—" She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Daniel Cross stood back, watching with satisfaction as his plan unfolded perfectly. Grace straightened her spine, dignity wrapping around her like armor. "I need to get home to my son," she said quietly. "The son you just proved you don't deserve." She turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The crowd parted before her like water, some faces showing sympathy, others cruel amusement. Jonathan stood rooted to the spot, his anger already giving way to a sick feeling in his stomach. He watched as Grace's blue dress disappeared through the grand doors, leaving behind only the echo of her footsteps and the weight of his cruel words. The buzz of conversation slowly resumed around him, but Jonathan barely heard it. He stared at the empty doorway, his chest tight with regret, knowing he had just destroyed something precious with his own hands. Jonathan's penthouse felt colder and emptier than usual as he stumbled through the door. The city lights twinkled beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed them. His hands shook as he loosened his bow tie and threw his tuxedo jacket onto the pristine white couch. The memory of Grace's face, hurt, shocked, betrayed, haunted him. Michael's confused eyes as his mother pulled him away burned in Jonathan's mind. He made his way to the bar cart in the corner, crystal decanters catching the dim light. Without thinking, he poured himself a generous measure of expensive scotch. The first sip burned his throat. He welcomed the sensation, anything to dull the shame coursing through him. The words he'd spat at Grace echoed in his head. Was this your plan all along? To humiliate me? To expose me to ridicule? Jonathan ran a hand over his face, remembering how Grace had simply stood there, dignity intact even as tears filled her eyes. She hadn't shouted back or made a scene, just like his mother used to do when faced with cruelty. The thought of his mother made him pause mid-sip. Martha Hale had raised him alone, working 3 jobs, enduring sideways glances and whispered comments about being a single black mother. He could still picture her pressed waitress uniform, her tired smile, the way she held her head high despite everything. "What would you think of me now, Mama?" he whispered to the empty room. He walked to the window, drink in hand, staring at his reflection in the glass. The successful CEO looked back at him, but all he saw was his father's face. The same cold pride, the same fear of vulnerability masked as strength. Another drink. The scotch wasn't helping, but he poured more anyway. His mother's voice came back to him, clear as day. "Baby, the world's gonna judge you no matter what. But don't you dare become the kind of person who judges others for struggling." Jonathan's chest tightened. He remembered a particular night when he was 12, finding his mother crying at their small kitchen table. She'd been turned down for a better job, one she was qualified for, because she wouldn't fit the company image. Yet the next morning, she'd gotten up, put on her uniform, and gone to work with her head held high. "Just like Grace," he muttered, the realization hitting him hard. He'd become everything his mother had warned him against. Worse, he'd become exactly like the man who'd abandoned them, quick to judge, quick to run when things got complicated. The memory of another night surfaced, his mother coming home late, her uniform stained with coffee, telling him about a kind customer who'd left her a $100 tip when others had mocked her accent. "That man showed me that money don't make character, baby. It's how you treat people when nobody's watching that shows who you really are." Jonathan's legs felt heavy as he made his way to his bedroom. The king-sized bed with its perfectly arranged pillows seemed to mock him. He'd achieved everything he'd ever wanted: wealth, power, respect. But tonight, he felt as small as that little boy watching his mother count pennies at the kitchen table. He loosened his shirt collar, the room spinning slightly from the scotch. On his nightstand sat a small worn photo he usually kept hidden in the drawer. Him and his mother at his high school graduation. Her pride had been so pure, so unconditional. Nothing like the cold, calculating pride he'd developed. "I became him," Jonathan whispered into the darkness as he fell onto the bed. "I became my father." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, worse than the scotch. He'd spent his whole life determined not to repeat his father's mistakes, only to find himself doing exactly that, pushing away the people who truly cared about him, judging them by standards his own mother would never have met. The ceiling blurred above him as tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years burned his eyes. In the quiet of his expensive penthouse, surrounded by all the trappings of success, Jonathan Hale finally faced the truth. He'd betrayed not just Grace and Michael, but everything his mother had taught him about compassion, dignity, and real strength. "I'm just like him. Like my father," he whispered to the dark, the words falling into the silence like stones into a deep well. The admission brought no relief, only the heavy weight of truth and shame as he lay there, alone with his regret. Sunlight stabbed through Jonathan's bedroom windows like angry needles. His head throbbed, and his mouth felt like sandpaper. Empty crystal glasses littered his nightstand, evidence of his desperate attempt to drown his shame the night before. He groaned, pushing himself up. The digital clock read 8:47 a.m., Sunday morning. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. Grace and Michael would be at church right now, probably sitting in their usual spot, third pew from the front. "What have I done?" he whispered, the memory of Grace's tear-stained face haunting him. After a quick shower and 2 aspirins, Jonathan dressed simply in khakis and a blue button-down shirt. No expensive suit today. He caught his reflection in the mirror. Dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his chin, humanity showing through his usually perfect facade. The drive to Grace's church felt longer than before. The modest building looked different without Grace and Michael by his side. Several cars filled the small parking lot, and he could hear the faint sound of hymns drifting through the open windows. Jonathan's hands gripped the steering wheel. Pride urged him to drive away, but something stronger, perhaps his mother's voice in his heart, made him step out of the car. He slipped quietly through the wooden doors, choosing a spot in the back pew where shadows helped him hide. The congregation stood, singing "Amazing Grace." The irony wasn't lost on him. Pastor James stood at the pulpit, his kind face lined with wisdom. Jonathan remembered how his mother used to speak of this man, how he'd helped her through hard times when Jonathan was just a boy. "Today," Pastor James began, his voice warm and steady, "we're talking about second chances." Jonathan's breath caught. He lowered his head, feeling exposed. "In Luke 15, we find the story of the prodigal son," the pastor continued. "A young man who chose pride over family, wealth over love. But what strikes me most isn't the son's mistakes. It's the father's response when his boy returns." Jonathan listened intently, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The pastor's words seemed aimed directly at his heart. The father didn't demand an explanation. He didn't list his son's failures. Instead, he ran to meet him. He wrapped him in love before a single word of apology could be spoken. Pastor James paused, scanning the congregation. "That's what grace looks like, friends. It's not earned. It's given freely." Memories flooded Jonathan's mind. His mother working multiple jobs, facing discrimination with dignity, teaching him about faith despite their struggles. He'd forgotten her lessons, buried them under years of ambition and self-protection. "Sometimes," Pastor James continued, "we build walls to protect ourselves, but end up prisoners of our own making. God's grace isn't just about forgiveness, it's about freedom. Freedom to love without fear, to be vulnerable, to choose what truly matters." A tear rolled down Jonathan's cheek. He quickly wiped it away, but more followed. The weight of his actions crashed over him. How he'd treated Grace. How he'd let fear of judgment override the love growing in his heart. How he'd become exactly what he'd always despised. When the congregation bowed for prayer, Jonathan closed his eyes tight. "God," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, help me fix this." The prayer continued around him, but Jonathan stayed in his own quiet conversation with God. He thought of Michael's innocent trust, of Grace's unwavering faith despite hardship. He'd been given a precious gift, a chance at family, at real love, and he'd thrown it away to protect his image. After the service ended, Jonathan remained seated as others filed out. Pastor James noticed him and approached quietly, sitting beside him in the empty pew. "Jonathan Hale," the pastor said softly, "your mother would be glad to see you here." "Would she?" Jonathan's voice was rough with emotion. "After what I've done?" "She knew something you seem to have forgotten," Pastor James replied. "That love is stronger than pride, and it's never too late to choose differently." Jonathan nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "I don't know if Grace can forgive me." "Grace has more strength than you realize," Pastor James said. "But the question is, are you ready to be worthy of that forgiveness? To put love above pride? Family above status?" "Yes," Jonathan answered without hesitation, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Whatever it takes." Pastor James smiled gently. "Then go with God, son. And remember, real strength isn't in never falling, but in rising again." Jonathan stood, feeling lighter despite the weight of what lay ahead. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the wooden pews with colors. He walked down the aisle, each step feeling like a decision, a commitment. At the church door he paused, looking back at the simple altar. His mother had found strength here, decades ago. Now, he understood why. He'd entered carrying shame and confusion, but he was leaving with something else: determination and clarity. The morning air felt fresh against his face as he stepped outside. He knew what he had to do, and for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of being vulnerable, whatever it cost him, his reputation, his position, even his pride. He would make things right. Jonathan stood in the wings of the Grand Conference Center, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his silk tie. The familiar buzz of reporters and cameras filled the massive hall where hundreds of business leaders and journalists had gathered for what they thought would be a standard corporate announcement. His assistant approached with a folder of prepared speeches. "Sir, the latest market projections and quarterly reports are ready for your presentation." Jonathan shook his head and gently pushed the folder away. "Not today, Sarah, not anymore." The stage lights blazed as the company's PR director introduced him. Jonathan took a deep breath, remembering the quiet strength in Grace's eyes when she sang at church, the pure love in Michael's smile. With steady steps, he walked onto the stage. Camera flashes burst like stars. The podium felt different today. Not a shield to hide behind, but a place to stand in truth. Jonathan gripped its edges and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. "I'm sure you're all waiting to hear about our company's latest achievements," he began, his voice clear and strong. "But today, I need to talk about something more important than profit margins and stock prices." A murmur rippled through the crowd. In the front row, Daniel Cross smirked, probably expecting a damage control speech about the gala incident. "6 months ago, I met a little boy in the rain," Jonathan continued. "He called me Daddy and showed me his mother, who was struggling just to survive. That night changed everything." The room grew still. Jonathan could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, but for once he didn't care about their judgment. "That woman, Grace Turner, has more dignity and strength than anyone I've ever known. She raised our son alone, never asking for help, never bitter about the hardships she faced. And my son, Michael," his voice caught for a moment, "he taught me what real success looks like. It's not in this suit or that corner office up there. It's in a child's trust, a mother's faith, and the courage to choose love over pride." In the silence, Jonathan could hear his own heartbeat. He thought of his mother, who had faced similar prejudice and whispers years ago. At last week's gala, someone tried to shame Grace by exposing her struggles. They thought her poverty was a weapon to use against her. Jonathan's gaze found Daniel Cross, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But they were wrong. Her strength in facing those struggles makes her more worthy of respect than any of us in our expensive suits and high-rise offices. A few scattered claps started, then grew. Jonathan raised his hand. "I'm not finished." He took another deep breath. "For too long, I've let fear and pride rule my decisions. I became exactly what I swore I'd never be: a man who abandoned his family because it was easier than facing his own failures. Today, that ends." The cameras clicked frantically as Jonathan stepped away from the podium, speaking now without its barrier. "To Grace and Michael, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every moment I let others' opinions matter more than your hearts. I'm sorry for every time I chose my reputation over our family. You deserve better, and if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I can be the man you both deserve." Tears pricked at his eyes, but Jonathan didn't try to hide them. "To everyone here, I stand before you not as a CEO, but as a man who finally understands what matters. If you want to judge someone, judge me for my past mistakes. But know that Grace and Michael are my family, and I will never again let anyone shame them for where they came from or what they've been through." The silence in the room was absolute. Then, from the back, a single person stood and started clapping. Like a wave, others joined in, rising to their feet. The applause grew until it thundered through the hall. Jonathan barely heard it. His heart was pounding, but not from fear. For the first time in years, maybe in his whole life, he felt truly at peace. The weight of pretense and pride fell away, leaving only the simple truth. He was a father and a man who had finally found his way home. As he stepped down from the stage, reporters surged forward with questions, but Jonathan walked past them all. His assistant approached with tears in her eyes. "That was beautiful, sir," she whispered. Jonathan smiled, touching her shoulder gently. "Thank you, Sarah. But I need to go. There's somewhere more important I need to be." The applause followed him as he walked through the conference center's grand doors. But he didn't look back. His heart was already racing ahead, toward the small apartment where he prayed Grace and Michael would give him one more chance to make things right. Grace sat on their worn couch, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap as she watched the television. Michael pressed against her side, his small hand clutching hers as Jonathan's familiar figure appeared on the screen. The local news was covering his company's press event live, and Grace's heart thundered in her chest, unsure why she had even turned it on. "Look, Mommy, it's Dad," Michael pointed excitedly, seemingly forgetting the tears he'd shed just days ago. The camera zoomed in on Jonathan's face. He stood behind the podium, looking immaculate in his tailored suit, but Grace noticed something different in his expression. The usual mask of corporate confidence had cracked, revealing something raw underneath. "I'm supposed to talk about quarterly projections today," Jonathan began, his voice slightly shaky. He pulled at his tie, loosening it. "But I need to speak about something more important." Grace held her breath. Michael squirmed closer. "A few weeks ago, I met a young boy and his mother in the rain." Jonathan's voice grew stronger. "That boy turned out to be my son, though I didn't know it then. His mother had raised him alone, with dignity and faith, never asking for anything." The television showed reactions from the crowd, raised eyebrows, whispers behind hands. Grace's cheeks burned, but she couldn't look away. "I've spent my career chasing success, thinking it would fill the emptiness left by my own father's absence," Jonathan continued. "But when my son called me Dad for the first time, I felt something money could never buy." Michael beamed. "He's talking about me. At a recent gala, someone tried to shame this woman, Grace Turner, for her modest background." Jonathan's jaw tightened visibly. "They mocked her struggles, her work as a waitress, her financial hardships. And his voice cracked. "I failed her. I let pride and fear make me just like my father." Grace wiped at her eyes, remembering the humiliation of that night, the cruel whispers, Jonathan's angry accusations. "But Grace taught me something about real strength," Jonathan said, his voice growing passionate. "She showed me that true dignity isn't about bank accounts or boardrooms. It's about loving your child enough to sacrifice everything. It's about keeping your faith when the world turns its back." The camera panned across shocked faces in the audience. Some were nodding now, others dabbing at their eyes. "So today, I'm not here to talk about profits. I'm here to publicly acknowledge my son, Michael Turner, and his remarkable mother. I'm here to say, I was wrong." Jonathan gripped the podium. "I choose family over fortune. I choose love over pride. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can find another CEO." Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, tears flowing freely now. Michael bounced on the couch. "Mommy, he loves us." The broadcast cut to commercial, but Grace barely noticed. Her mind was spinning with Jonathan's words, her heart a storm of hope and hurt. A knock at the door made them both jump. "I'll get it." Michael scrambled off the couch. "Wait, honey." Grace started, but Michael had already thrown the door open. Jonathan stood in the hallway, still in his press conference suit, his tie completely loose now. His eyes were red-rimmed, his usually perfect hair slightly mussed. He looked like he'd run all the way there. "Michael," he breathed, then dropped to his knees, right there in the doorway. "Son, I was wrong. So wrong." Michael hesitated for just a moment before flinging himself into Jonathan's arms. Grace stood slowly, her legs shaky. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said over Michael's shoulder, looking at Grace with naked pain in his eyes. "I'm sorry for letting fear win. For caring more about what others thought than what was right." His voice broke. "For becoming exactly what I swore I'd never be." Grace wrapped her arms around herself, fighting the urge to run to him. "You hurt us," she whispered. "I know." Jonathan held Michael tighter. "I've spent my whole life building walls to protect myself from pain. But all I did was cause pain to the two people who matter most." Michael pulled back to look at his father's face. "Are you staying this time?" "If your mother will let me," Jonathan answered, his eyes never leaving Grace's. "I want to be the father you deserve, the man Grace believed I could be." Grace felt her resolve crumbling. She saw the truth in his eyes, the same earnest light she'd glimpsed during their day at the park. But this time, there was no holding back, no careful distance. "Please," Jonathan said softly, "give me a chance to make this right." Michael looked between them anxiously. Grace took a shaky breath, then stepped forward. "You can't run away again," she said firmly. "Michael needs stability. He needs a father who stays," Jonathan finished. "I know. I promise you both. No more running." Grace felt tears spill over again. But these were different from the bitter ones she'd shed at the gala. These felt like release, like hope. She nodded slowly, and Michael gave a whoop of joy. "Daddy came back!" he shouted, throwing his arms around Jonathan's neck again. Grace closed the distance between them, her heart full as Jonathan pulled her into their embrace. They stood there in the doorway, holding each other, a family pieced back together by faith, forgiveness, and the pure love of a little boy who never stopped believing in his father. The aroma of garlic and tomatoes filled Grace's small kitchen as she stirred the simmering pasta sauce. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the steam rising from the pot. She glanced at the clock. 6:15 p.m. Jonathan had promised to be here by 6. Just then, she heard Michael's excited squeal from the living room. "Daddy's here!" Grace's heart skipped as she heard the door open and Jonathan's warm greeting. His footsteps approached the kitchen, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway. His tie loosened and suit jacket draped over his arm. "I brought dessert," he said, holding up a brown paper bag. "Michael mentioned you liked chocolate cake." Grace smiled, touched by the simple gesture. "You didn't have to. I wanted to." He rolled up his sleeves and moved beside her at the stove. "What can I do to help?" "You can start on the salad," she said, pointing to the vegetables on the cutting board. "If you know how to chop vegetables, that island," Jonathan chuckled. "I may be a CEO, but I did learn some basic life skills along the way." He picked up the knife with surprising confidence and began slicing tomatoes. Michael bounced into the kitchen, homework paper in hand. "Daddy, can you check my math? Miss Rodriguez said I did good today." Well," Grace corrected gently. Jonathan wiped his hands on a dish towel and crouched down to Michael's level. "Let's see what you've got there, buddy." He examined the paper covered in multiplication tables, his expression serious. "This is excellent work. You're getting better every day." Grace watched them together, noting how naturally Jonathan had slipped into this role of father and partner in their daily routines. It was so different from his earlier stiff, formal visits. After dinner they gathered in the living room. Michael sprawled on the carpet with his favorite dinosaur book, while Jonathan sat cross-legged beside him, pointing at the pictures and asking questions. Grace curled up in her armchair, crocheting a winter scarf and listening to their conversation. "Why did the T-Rex have such tiny arms?" Michael asked, tracing the illustration with his finger. "Well," Jonathan began, "scientists think they didn't need big arms because their powerful legs and huge jaws did all the work. Like how you don't need a fancy car because your legs work just fine?" Michael asked innocently. Grace stifled a laugh as Jonathan blinked in surprise. He'd started taking the bus to their apartment instead of arriving in his luxury vehicle, trying to fit more naturally into their world. "That's actually a pretty good comparison," Jonathan admitted, ruffling Michael's hair. When bedtime came, Michael insisted on both parents participating in the ritual. Grace watched from the doorway as Jonathan sat on the edge of the bed, reading Where the Wild Things Are, with different voices for each character. Michael's eyes grew heavy, but he fought sleep to hear the end of the story. "One more chapter?" he pleaded. "Tomorrow night," Jonathan promised, tucking the blanket around him. "I'll be here." Grace's breath caught at those words. She'd heard too many broken promises in her life, but something in Jonathan's tone rang true. He'd been showing up consistently for the past week, not just for the fun moments, but for the mundane ones too. After Michael fell asleep, they sat at the small kitchen table, sharing slices of the chocolate cake Jonathan had brought. The comfortable silence between them was new, replacing the earlier tension that had marked their interactions. "You didn't answer any work calls during dinner," Grace observed, running her fork through the chocolate frosting. Jonathan set down his coffee cup. "I've started delegating more, hired 2 new vice presidents last week." He met her eyes. "Some things are more important than quarterly reports." "And your board members? What do they think about their CEO leaving early to read bedtime stories?" "They'll adapt," he said firmly. "Or they can find someone else. I've spent years building that company, but I won't lose another family for it." Grace studied his face, looking for any trace of the prideful man who had once been so concerned with appearances. Instead, she saw someone who looked more at peace, despite the shadows of fatigue under his eyes from adjusting to this new rhythm of life. "It's not easy, is it?" she asked softly. "Changing everything you've known?" Jonathan shook his head. "No, it's not, but it's worth it." He gestured around the modest kitchen. "This, being here, being part of your lives, it feels more real than any business deal I've ever closed." Later that night, after Jonathan had gone home and Michael was deep in dreams, Grace knelt beside her bed, as she did every evening. The moonlight filtered through her thin curtains, casting a gentle glow around her room. She closed her eyes, her hands clasped in prayer. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for your patience with stubborn hearts, mine and Jonathan's. Thank you for showing him there's more to life than success and status. Thank you for softening his heart and helping him choose love over pride." A tear slipped down her cheek as she remembered Jonathan's face, while reading to Michael, the genuine joy that had replaced his usual guarded expression. It was the answer to prayers she'd been praying since Michael was born. Not just for financial support, but for a father who would truly love her son. She opened her eyes and gazed at the family photo Michael had drawn at school that day, now proudly displayed on her dresser. 3 figures stood hand in hand, Mommy, Michael, and Daddy, all with big smiles under a bright yellow sundae. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but God had His own way of bringing healing to broken places. The school gymnasium buzzed with excitement as fathers and sons filed in for the annual Dad and Me Day. Jonathan tugged at his casual polo shirt's collar, feeling out of place among the crowd of parents. He'd swapped his usual tailored suit for jeans and comfortable shoes, but anxiety still churned in his stomach. Michael bounced beside him, practically vibrating with energy. "Look, Dad, they have a 3-legged race, and basketball, and, oh, they're building rockets." Jonathan smiled, his nervousness easing at his son's enthusiasm. The gym had been transformed into a carnival of activity stations. Fathers and sons clustered around different areas, some attempting craft projects, others lining up for sports challenges. "Which one should we try first?" Jonathan asked, scanning the room. Michael grabbed his hand, pulling him toward a table covered in cardboard, tape, and plastic bottles. "The rockets! Tommy said they shoot them with air pressure and everything." At the rocket-building station, Jonathan found himself sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Michael, carefully helping him tape fins to their makeshift spacecraft. His fingers, more used to signing contracts than crafting, fumbled with the materials. "Like this, Dad," Michael demonstrated, showing surprising dexterity as he secured a piece of cardboard. "Miss Wilson taught us about aerodynamics last week." Jonathan watched in amazement as his son expertly shaped their rocket. "You're quite the scientist, aren't you?" "Mom says I get my smarts from you," Michael said matter-of-factly, concentrating on his work. The simple statement made Jonathan's heart swell. From across the gym, Grace watched them from her spot among other parents who'd come to observe. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, trying to be discreet. Seeing Jonathan fully engaged with Michael, without any trace of his former corporate stiffness, moved her deeply. After completing their rocket, father and son joined the launch line. The science teacher operating the air pressure launcher grinned at Michael. "Ready to test your creation?" Michael nodded eagerly, then turned to Jonathan. "Dad, you help me aim it." Jonathan knelt behind Michael, helping him position the rocket on the launcher. Together, they counted down. 3, 2, 1. Their rocket soared across the gymnasium, drawing cheers from the crowd as it flew further than most others. Michael jumped up and down, hugging Jonathan tightly. "We did it, Dad! We did it!" They moved from station to station, trying everything from the basketball shooting contest to the engineering challenge of building the tallest paper tower. Jonathan found himself laughing more than he had in years, especially during the 3-legged race, where he and Michael tumbled onto the mat, giggling helplessly. During a snack break, Michael's teacher approached them. "Michael, would you like to introduce your father to the class?" Michael straightened proudly, taking Jonathan's hand. "This is my dad," he announced to his classmates. He's a CEO, but that's not the most important thing. He's really good at helping with math homework, and he makes funny voices when he reads stories, and he never misses dinner with us anymore." Jonathan felt tears prick his eyes at Michael's words. He squeezed his son's hand gently, noticing Grace wiping away her own tears in the background. Several other fathers came over to chat, treating Jonathan like any other dad rather than the powerful executive they might have known from business circles. He found himself relaxing into conversations about Little League and school projects instead of stock prices and corporate mergers. As the event wound down, Michael collected his participation ribbon and their somewhat dented but victorious rocket. Walking toward Grace, he chattered excitedly about their achievements. "Mom! Mom! Our rocket went the furthest, and Dad and I almost won the three-legged race, but we fell down. But it was so fun when we fell." Grace laughed, pulling Michael into a hug. "I saw. You two were amazing." She looked up at Jonathan, her eyes soft with appreciation. "Both of you. Can we have pizza for dinner?" Michael asked hopefully. "To celebrate?" "I think that can be arranged," Grace said, exchanging a warm smile with Jonathan. Later that evening, they gathered around Grace's small kitchen table, sharing a large pepperoni pizza. Michael regaled them with a blow-by-blow account of every activity, punctuating his stories with generous bites. "And then Dad got glitter all over his face in the craft station?" Michael giggled, demonstrating with his hands. "I still think some of it's in my hair," Jonathan chuckled, running a hand through his usually perfectly styled hair. Grace reached over without thinking, brushing a sparkly speck from his temple. Their eyes met briefly, and she blushed, but her smile remained. The kitchen echoed with laughter as they shared more stories from the day. Even the typically reserved Jonathan joined in enthusiastically, describing their spectacular three-legged race wipeout with animated gestures. Michael sat between them, happier than they'd ever seen him, occasionally leaning against one parent or the other as he enjoyed his dinner. The simple meal in the modest kitchen felt more satisfying to Jonathan than any expensive restaurant he'd ever visited. They were no longer three separate people trying to navigate a complicated situation. Tonight, they were simply a family, sharing pizza and laughter, glitter in their hair, and joy in their hearts. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews of Grace's small neighborhood church. Jonathan sat between Grace and Michael, his shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been in years. The familiar scent of old hymnals and polished wood filled the air as the congregation sang, "Amazing Grace." Michael swayed to the music, his small voice joining the chorus with childlike enthusiasm. Jonathan glanced down at his son, marveling at how naturally the word son now came to his thoughts. Grace's clear, sweet voice carried the melody beside him, and Jonathan found himself humming along, something he hadn't done since his mother took him to church as a child. Pastor Roberts delivered his sermon with warmth and wisdom, speaking about new beginnings and God's perfect timing. Jonathan felt the words settle deep in his heart, remembering how just weeks ago he'd come here alone, broken and seeking forgiveness. Now, he sat as part of a family, Grace's hand resting gently in his. After the final hymn, several church members approached them, their faces bright with genuine welcome. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who had known Grace for years, hugged them all, including Jonathan. "It does my heart good to see you three together," she said, patting Jonathan's arm. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." Michael tugged at Jonathan's sleeve. "Can we go to the park now, please, Daddy?" The word still sent a warm flutter through Jonathan's chest every time he heard it. "Of course we can, buddy," Jonathan replied, ruffling Michael's hair. "Let's just say goodbye to Pastor Roberts first." The pastor met them at the door, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Jonathan," he said, clasping his hand firmly, "it's good to see you making this your Sunday home." "Thank you, Pastor," Jonathan replied, meaning it. "Your words that day, they helped more than you know." Outside, the spring air carried the sweet scent of blooming cherry trees. Jonathan loosened his tie as they walked toward the nearby park, Michael skipping ahead but always staying within sight. Grace's sundress fluttered in the gentle breeze, and Jonathan couldn't help but admire how she glowed in the morning light. They found a quiet path that wound through flowering dogwoods. Michael darted between trees, chasing a butterfly, while Jonathan and Grace walked hand in hand. The path opened to a small clearing, where a wooden bench overlooked a pond. Jonathan guided Grace to sit. "Remember when we first met?" he asked softly. "That rainy night when Michael found me?" Grace nodded, her eyes growing misty. "I was so scared and ashamed. I never thought. God had other plans," Jonathan finished, squeezing her hand. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding with nervous excitement. "Grace, these past weeks have taught me more about love and faith than all my years of success ever did. Watching you with Michael, seeing your strength and grace, no pun intended," they both chuckled. "It's shown me what really matters." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I don't want to just provide financial support anymore. I want us to be a real family. You, me, and Michael together, facing whatever comes our way. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're both there, share meals together, make plans together." His voice grew thick with emotion. "I want to be the man you both deserve." Grace's eyes welled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Jonathan, I know I hurt you," he continued. "I know I have a lot to make up for. But if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life showing you and Michael how much you mean to me." He squeezed her hands gently. "What do you say? Will you let me be part of your life? Really part of it?" A tear slid down Grace's cheek as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Jonathan." He pulled her close, their foreheads touching, both of them overcome with emotion. The moment was broken by Michael's excited shout from further down the path. "Mommy! Daddy, look at the ducks!" Michael bounced on his toes, pointing at a family of mallards swimming in the pond. "They're all together, just like us!" Grace laughed through her tears, and Jonathan helped her to her feet. They walked toward their son, who had already started running ahead again, his energy boundless. "Hurry up, Daddy!" Michael called over his shoulder, his face beaming with joy. Jonathan's heart swelled as he watched his son, feeling Grace's warm hand in his. He turned to her, his voice soft but firm with conviction. "I'm never walking away again." Together, they followed their son down the sun-dappled path, their steps in perfect sync. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting a golden glow over their little family. Grace's gentle smile, Michael's boundless enthusiasm, and Jonathan's quiet contentment. In that moment, they were more than just three people walking through a park. They were a family, bound together by love, faith, and the promise of tomorrow. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Jonathan Hale, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.